Even at 66, Lawrence Taylor's name carries the same weight it did during his playing days. Widely seen as the greatest defensive player in NFL history, Taylor dominated the field for 13 seasons with the New York Giants. He changed the way the linebacker position was played, forcing offenses to completely rewrite their playbooks just to try and contain him. Now, with decades of reflection behind him, Taylor is opening up about the players who pushed him to his limits, the ones who earned his respect, not just for talent, but for heart, toughness, and an unwillingness to back down. Before we meet the men LT counted as his toughest, it helps to remember why that mattered. Lawrence Taylor reshaped football. He wasn't merely a great pass rusher. He reimagined what an outside linebacker could do. He came into the NFL as a frenzied athlete who could explode off the edge, play the run, drop into coverage, and unsettle every offensive game plan he touched. Opposing coaches started designing schemes specifically to slow him down. Entire game plans were altered because he existed. Those changes weren't incidental. They were a direct response to the way LT played. His influence is part of football history. That said, even the greatest player meets resistance. For LT, the toughest opponents fell into several categories: elite offensive tackles who neutralized speed with technique, massive interior linemen who broke up plays at the point of attack, crafty veterans who used leverage and angle to keep him from getting around the edge, and, occasionally, players he said were simply meaner or smarter than the rest. What follows is a portrait of those opponents, told in the style of a fan magazine feature and built from LT's public reflections, autobiographical moments, and the consensus memory of the league. Lawrence Taylor's rookie season arrived like a thunderclap. He shocked offenses, terrorized quarterbacks, and made highlight reels his first year. But veteran linemen and tackles taught him lessons the hard way: how to tie him up with hands, how to bend his rush, and how to force him to win with more than pure speed. One early lesson came from multi-position tough-as-nails front seven players, not always one name but a style. Interior force and disciplined, violent hands. Giants opponents in the 1980s were not just prone to fear, they planned, prepared, and schemed. In those first years, Taylor learned that when a tackle had perfect leverage and technique, brute force alone wouldn't do the trick. He had to bend his rush, counter their counters, and read the whole play in milliseconds. Those were the nights when a being like LT came home upstairs from practice and thought, "I need to get smarter." His rookie film study would grow into a craft. When you talk about the great offensive tackles of Lawrence Taylor's era, one name that towers is Anthony Munoz. Munoz has been widely celebrated as perhaps the greatest offensive tackle in NFL history, a combination of power, technique, and length that made him a nightmare for pass rushers and a pillar in the Bengals' run schemes. Facing him wasn't just about overcoming size. It was about outsmarting a technician who had limitless angles and a refusal to be bulldozed. For a player like LT, Munoz represented the archetype of the complete tackle. Munoz could mirror speed, anchor against bull rushes, and use perfectly timed hands to neutralize the edge. Everything a pure speed rusher hates. Giants games against Cincinnati were chess matches. LT measured Munoz's hands, pinpointed when the tackle would overextend, and sought creative ways to win: stunts, late hands, patience. Even when he got an advantage, it felt earned. Munoz's stature in the sport and the respect his peers showed him make it obvious why Lawrence would cite tackles like Munoz as among the toughest he encountered. If LT feared edge blockers who could mirror him, he had an equal respect for interior linemen who made the middle of the line a temple of strength. John Hanna was not a tackle but a guard, and his reputation reads like gospel among old-school linemen: relentless leg drive, textbook technique, and an ability to make defenders vanish. Hanna has been called one of the greatest offensive linemen ever. Sports Illustrated labeled him the best offensive lineman of all time during his playing years. Those were the types of players who tested LT differently, by closing running lanes, absorbing double teams, and forcing him into longer, more physical battles. For Taylor, an elite guard meant attention to detail was non-negotiable. It wasn't enough to beat the tackle. He needed to navigate two-man blocks, pull guards, and trap schemes designed to take his speed off the edge. Hannah and players like him were the craftspeople of the trenches, and when you face someone who never gives up leverage and always finishes with violent hands, you leave the game knowing you'd been privileged to test your limits. There's a special kind of frustration that comes from facing a lineman who can play multiple spots and still wreck your game. Joe Klecko offered exactly that. Known primarily for his dominance with the New York Jets' New York sack exchange, Klecko shifted between end tackle and nose tackle during his career, and he did it with an intensity and strength that forced you to wrestle for every inch. For LT, Klecko represented the kind of opponent that broke the rhythm of a rush. When a player can line up inside one play and outside the next, it forces a rusher to reevaluate angles and timing, and at times to grind the play out in hand-to-hand combat. Klecko's ability to shrug off blocks and anchor a play meant that LT sometimes had to abandon his usual instincts and find new ways to generate pressure. Those games were measured in small victories. A disruption here, a forced throw there, not always sacks, but moments of influence. Not all tough opponents for LT were technically perfect superstars. Some were simply massive, brutal, and unyielding, men who lived to impose their will at the line of scrimmage. These were players who didn't get big headlines but ground out wins and punished defenders every snap. The narrative of LT's career is full of these matchups. The running game armies, the plodding centers who could stonewall a blitz, and veteran linemen who treated the pocket like a personal backyard. One thing LT publicly acknowledged again and again was that beating such men was a test of mentality. Speed might get you around the corner once or twice, but power and discipline would chew you up over the course of a game. He always said the truly tough players forced him to finish every play, to stay bent and balanced, to engage and disengage in perfect microseconds. Those grinded-out matchups are the kind that leave you with bruises that last 2 weeks and pride that lasts forever. Taylor's greatness was measured by how often offensive coordinators refused to let him beat them with a pure one-on-one pass rush. To neutralize LT, teams turned to creative solutions, chip blocks from running backs, tight ends staying in to help on the edge, or hitching a tackle's leg to his shoulder. Players like Jimbo Covert, big tight ends, and physical running backs often became makeshift blockers. And in that improvisation, LT sometimes found his most complicated challenges. Those were the chess moves of the era. And they reflected a simple truth. When everyone adjusts to you, you learn to adjust back. Jimbo Covert's reputation as a top bear of a tackle is part of that conversation, with Chicago's O-line from the era known for frontal assaults against rushers. These matchups are instructive because they reveal the sport's nuance. Sometimes the toughest player isn't the one lined up across from you, but the one who comes from the backfield, or the tight end on that third down heroic block. LT's own adjustments to these schemes, stunts, inside moves, timing the snap, became part of his evolution. Half the battle for a pass rusher is psychological, winning the first exchange before the whistle. Veteran linemen with long careers know how to employ subtle tactics, jab at the hands, feign a drop, mess up a rush lane with a tiny late step. For LT, veterans who specialized in mental games were the toughest because they forced him out of rhythm and into frustration. Sometimes that's enough to lose a full drive. In the post-game recounts and in his memoir, LT talked about moments when he'd been drawn into a tug-of-war over technique with men who had been there, and how much he learned from losing those battles early on. LT's era in the NFC East produced matchups that felt like cultural events. Washington's intimidating fronts, Philly's gritty lines, and Dallas's disciplined units all taught him something different. Each game was a crucible. 1 week, it was a Washington defensive scheme that caused trouble. The next, it was a Dallas plan that forced him to adapt. Those rivalries did more for LT than win-loss columns did. They accelerated his growth. The defenders and linemen in that conference were steel-forged. The constant repetition of high-stakes battles pushed LT to layer his game. One of the most revealing parts of LT's reflections, the part that shows the craftsman behind the menace, is about how tough opponents forced him to become a student. Beyond the brute force and the sudden sacks, Lawrence studied. He watched film like a chess master watches endgames. He cataloged who used outside hands, who used inside chop blocks, which tackles overreached. That attention to detail, film study, learning angles, timing, was his answer to men who could stop him with experience or technique. In LT's own telling, sometimes the toughest opponent was the guy who could quiet the crowd and the cameras with a simple, unflashy play. A perfect block, a pull that caught the defense out of shape, a screen that neutralized a blitz. Those were the moments that taught him humility and patience. Let's not let the toughest opponent's framing obscure the obvious. Lawrence Taylor's career stats and accolades are staggering. MVP in 1986, 3-time Defensive Player of the Year, 2-time Super Bowl champion, 10-time Pro Bowler. These aren't footnotes. They're proof that you can be tested every week and still dominate. His sack totals, forceful plays, and game-changing turnovers shaped a generation of defenses. Those achievements were built on adapting and learning. The toughest opponents, from all-pro tackles to unsung interior bruisers, were the reason LT had to become more than a one-trick horse. They made him broader, deeper, and ultimately legendary. If you read LT's memoir and interviews, you'll notice another layer. Toughest doesn't simply mean physically imposing. It often meant men who forced introspection, who exposed a weakness in the rush, or teammates who demanded accountability. Facing great opponents taught LT about recovery, patience, and the value of preparation. Off the field, the respect he retained for certain opponents came from knowing those men had given everything they had. That mutual respect is the human center of this story. Two athletes, both trying to assert their will, both using the rules and craft of the game to do it. In that shared battlefield, respect is often the only currency left. When LT talks about being tested, he often circles back to the grind, the drills that sharpen an edge after a rough game. For pass rushers, the remedy for being shut down is always repetition. Hand-fighting drills, ankle strengthening, technique refinements, and endless film reviews. A matchup against a man like Munoz or Hanna doesn't lead to resignation. It leads to adaptation. You change your footwork, refine your counter moves, and you return stronger. Those routines were the secret behind LT's ability to be dominant across seasons and to return after injuries. LT's career was not without injury. He pushed through a torn pectoral, nagging ailments, and the general wear that comes from 13 seasons of violent collisions. The men he faced, especially large seasoned linemen, took a toll. But those same players taught him how to manage pain, when to push, when to rest, and how to rehab smartly. He learned to treat recovery as training, and the toughness of the opponents became a mirror for his own resilience. There's a paradox here. While Lawrence Taylor is often named the single greatest defensive player in NFL history, his greatness was forged by others. In naming the toughest players he faced, whether openly, as in interviews and his memoir, or indirectly through the film and legend of the game, LT acknowledged a simple truth. Greatness doesn't exist in a vacuum. Anthony Munoz's technique, John Hanna's anchor, Joe Klecko's versatility, the constant physicality of interior linemen and crafty veterans. These men forced LT to become a figure who would change the sport. It's worth repeating, when giants test each other, the result is usually a better game and a deeper legacy. LT's story, and the list of his toughest opponents, is a testament to that competitive crucible. The league evolved because players like LT and the men who opposed him kept raising the stakes. One of the most consistent pieces of advice LT offers younger players is this: welcome the toughest tests. If you don't, you'll plateau. Study your opponents the way a musician studies a difficult piece, with small repetitions and perfection of form. Work on fundamentals, because the men who will trouble you will often get you with technique, not swagger. And remember the human side. Respect your competitors. They make you better. LT's life after football reflections point to humility, accountability, and the idea that the real measure of a career is the work you do after being knocked down. At 66, when people ask Lawrence Taylor about the toughest players he's faced, he doesn't deliver a curt list and walk away. He tells stories of long nights of film study sparked by a single block, of the strange pride of losing a match because you were beaten by a better man that day, and of how those tests taught him how to be a teammate, a father, and ultimately a human being. In the end, the toughest aren't merely names on a roster, they're the craftsmen who made a young man with raw talent refine his art. To read LT's reflections is to be reminded that greatness is relational. It's built by the friction of opposition, the grind of practice, the humility of defeat, and the joy of getting up again. The men who challenged LT, from the superlatives like Anthony Munoz and John Hanna to the gritty, unsung interior bullies, are part of that story. They are, in the truest sense, co-authors of his legend